Title: Beneath the Surface. Act 1. Discovery of Infidelity. Chapter 1. The Illusion of Perfection. Sophie sat on the plush velvet couch in the living room, bathed in the soft glow of the golden light from their designer chandelier. The room was a perfect reflection of the life she and David had built, aesthetic and carefully curated. Marble countertops gleamed from the adjoining kitchen, untouched by the chaos of everyday life, and the walls were adorned with artwork they had collected over the years. Everything looked exactly as it should, a perfect, prosperous, successful life. But as Sophie watched David knot his silk tie in the hallway mirror, she couldn't shake the growing tension inside her. He was preparing for yet another late night at the office, a routine that had become far too familiar in recent months. David looked immaculate as always. His tailored suit hugged his athletic frame, his hair styled just right, and the scent of his expensive cologne lingered in the air even after he left a room. As he slipped on his watch, his movements were swift, almost rehearsed, and Sophie caught a glimpse of the man she once fell deeply in love with. David's charm was magnetic, the way he could command a room with his presence, making anyone feel like they were the only person that mattered. In the early years of their marriage, Sophie had felt that same magic every day. He had swept her off her feet, showering her with attention and affection. Their life had unfolded like a dream. But now, that magic had faded. Sophie still felt the occasional flutter of affection when he smiled at her, but those moments had become few and far between. Lately, David seemed preoccupied, distracted, even. His late nights were more frequent, and when he was home, his attention was often buried in his phone or laptop, answering urgent work emails. Their conversations had dwindled into polite exchanges about the day, and the warmth between them was slowly being replaced by a distant, cool politeness. Tonight, he seemed especially eager to leave. He finished adjusting his tie, glanced at the clock, and grabbed his briefcase. Walking towards Sophie, he bent down and kissed her on the cheek, his lips grazing her skin just enough to feel impersonal, like a routine he'd performed countless times before. "I'll be back late," David said, his voice casual. "Don't wait up." Sophie nodded, forcing a smile. "Okay, be safe." And just like that, he was out the door, leaving her alone in their pristine, silent home. The moment the door clicked shut, Sophie exhaled a long, shaky breath. For weeks, she had been trying to ignore the nagging feeling in her gut, dismissing it as paranoia or the stress of David's demanding job. But tonight, the unease settled heavier in her chest. The silence in the house felt oppressive, amplifying her loneliness. She glanced at the untouched wine glass on the coffee table, the deep red liquid reflecting the dim light, and for a brief second, she wondered if this was how things would always be, perfect on the outside, hollow on the inside. In the early days of their relationship, Sophie had admired David's ambition. He was driven, charismatic, and passionate about his work. She had believed that his success was their success, and she was proud of him. But somewhere along the way, that pride had morphed into isolation. David's work had consumed him, leaving little room for the love and connection they once shared. Sophie wasn't naive. She knew that relationships evolved, and that the heady excitement of new love often gave way to more grounded companionship. But this felt different. It wasn't just that they had grown comfortable. It was that they had grown apart. And no matter how much she tried to ignore it, she couldn't shake the feeling that something, or someone, was pulling him away from her. Chapter 2. The First Clue. The discovery came on an otherwise unremarkable Saturday evening. Sophie had spent the afternoon organizing the kitchen cabinets, another attempt to distract herself from the restless feeling she couldn't seem to shake. David had spent most of the day in his office, working on a proposal, or so he said, and she had barely seen him aside from a brief hello that morning. After dinner, David announced that he was going to take a quick shower before heading out to meet some colleagues for drinks. Sophie offered a half-hearted nod, her mind elsewhere as she dried the dishes. As David disappeared upstairs, his phone remained charging on the kitchen counter. It was an unusual move for him. David was glued to his phone, rarely leaving it unattended. Sophie continued her routine, wiping down the counters and tidying up the kitchen, but her eyes kept flicking toward the phone. She wasn't the type to snoop. In fact, the thought of invading David's privacy made her uncomfortable. But something about the phone sitting there, unlocked and accessible, tugged at her curiosity. Maybe she was being irrational. Maybe there was nothing to find. But then, as if fate had stepped in to intervene, the phone lit up with a notification. Sophie froze, her heart suddenly pounding in her chest. Slowly, she turned her gaze to the screen and saw a name she didn't recognize, Lauren. Her breath caught in her throat. She hesitated, telling herself it was probably nothing. Lauren could be a colleague, a client, anyone. But the message that followed dispelled any hope of that. The words were brief, but unmistakable. "Can't wait to see you tonight. Last time was amazing," winking face. The room seemed to close in on Sophie, the air thick with disbelief. Her fingers hovered over the phone, her pulse thudding in her ears. A hot wave of nausea washed over her stomach turning as the reality of what she was seeing set in. David was cheating. Sophie stared at the phone, torn between the overwhelming urge to read more and the crippling fear of what she might find. She knew that if she unlocked the phone and scrolled through the messages, she would see everything, every lie, every betrayal. But at that moment, she wasn't ready to face it. The sound of the water shutting off upstairs jolted her out of her daze. She quickly placed the phone back where she had found it and stepped away, her hands trembling. Her mind was racing, spinning with questions she couldn't yet answer. Who was Lauren? How long had this been going on? Was it just one time? Or had David been lying to her for months? Years? When David came downstairs a few minutes later, freshly showered and dressed for his night out, Sophie smiled at him like nothing had changed. But inside, she felt like she was free-falling, her world crumbling beneath her feet. "I'll see you later," David said, grabbing his phone off the counter without a second glance. He kissed her lightly on the lips before heading out the door, his voice calm and reassuring, as if he hadn't just shattered her heart. Sophie stood there in the silence, the weight of her discovery pressing down on her like a heavy stone. She didn't confront him that night. She didn't even cry. Instead, she stared at the door long after it had closed, her mind already calculating what to do next. David thought he had fooled her. But Sophie was no fool. Chapter 3. Gathering Evidence. The days that followed Sophie's discovery were a blur of suspicion and silent resolve. Every time David came home, kissed her cheek, and uttered his usual excuses for another late night, the weight of his lies hung heavier in the air. But now, Sophie was watching him through a different lens, her every interaction with him tinged by the truth she had uncovered. David's behavior became more erratic. His late nights at the office grew even more frequent, and when Sophie asked where he had been, his responses were clipped, evasive. His excuses began to lose their polish, like a well-rehearsed line that had been said one too many times. The cracks in his facade were widening, and Sophie could see through every one of them. It didn't take long for her to begin investigating on her own. She wasn't reckless. David's phone rarely left his side these days, but on the few occasions he left it unattended, Sophie would quickly glance through it. Each time, she found the message history wiped clean. There were no texts, no calls, nothing. But that in itself was suspicious. David had never been one to delete things from his phone, and the effort he was making to cover his tracks confirmed what Sophie already knew. He was hiding something. She checked the bank statements and credit card bills, and soon enough, there were more clues. Fancy dinners at restaurants they had never visited together. Hotel charges that were billed on weekends when David claimed to be out of town for work. Sophie's heart sank further with every new discovery, the pieces of David's deceit falling into place like a puzzle she hadn't asked to solve. And then there were the phone calls. They were brief, and David always stepped out of the room to take them. But Sophie had noticed the same unknown number appearing over and over again. The name Lauren echoed in her mind, like a ghost haunting her every thought. It was too much for her to bear alone, but Sophie wasn't ready to confront him. Not yet. Instead, she took the next step, hiring a private investigator. The decision had felt surreal at first, like something out of a movie she never thought she'd be starring in. But Sophie knew she needed hard evidence, something undeniable, and she needed to remain calm, discreet, if she wanted to take David down without him ever seeing it coming. The investigator worked quickly, more quickly than Sophie had anticipated. Within days, she received the call. David wasn't just having an affair. He had been involved with his assistant, Lauren, for nearly a year. The investigator's voice was steady, matter-of-fact, as he laid out the details. There were hotel receipts, intimate dinners, and secret weekend getaways. Sophie's heart pounded in her chest as she listened, her stomach twisting with nausea, but she kept her voice steady. Then came the damning evidence, photos. When Sophie received the envelope from the investigator, she waited until she was alone, sitting at the same kitchen table where she had first seen the message from Lauren on David's phone. She opened the envelope with trembling fingers, pulling out the pictures that would confirm her worst fears. The images were clear. David and Lauren, smiling, laughing, walking into a hotel together, their bodies pressed close as they disappeared behind the door. One photo showed them sitting at a candlelit dinner, their hands brushing across the table. Another, far more intimate, was of them embracing in a hotel hallway, completely unaware of the camera capturing their betrayal. Sophie felt sick. Her eyes blurred with tears, but she didn't let them fall. She forced herself to look at each picture, to commit every detail to memory. She needed to see it, needed to absorb the reality of David's affair before she could move forward. And then, something inside her shifted. The devastation was still there, raw and painful, but alongside it, a new emotion began to take root: anger. It burned slowly at first, simmering beneath the surface as she stared at the photos. But as the minutes ticked by, it grew stronger, hotter. David had been living a double life. He had lied to her, deceived her, and made her feel small and insignificant, all while pretending to be the perfect husband. But Sophie wasn't small. She wasn't weak, and she wouldn't let David destroy her. Not in the way he thought, at least. Chapter 4. The Calm Before the Storm. The old Sophie might have crumbled under the weight of such betrayal. She might have cried herself to sleep, confronted David in a fit of rage, or packed her bags and left. But that wasn't who she was anymore. Something in Sophie had shifted, hardened in the aftermath of her discovery. The tears that once threatened to fall had dried up, replaced by a steely determination she hadn't known she was capable of. As David continued his charade, blissfully unaware that Sophie now knew every sordid detail of his affair, she made a decision. She would not confront him, not yet. She wouldn't scream, wouldn't throw the photos in his face, or demand answers to questions she already knew the answers to. No, Sophie was done giving David the power to hurt her. Instead, she would hurt him, quietly, methodically. She would destroy his life piece by piece, just as he had done to hers. It started small. Sophie played the role of the loving, supportive wife perfectly, smiling when David came home late, pretending to believe his excuses about work dinners and business trips. She never let on that she knew about Lauren, that she had seen the photos, or that she had hired a private investigator. David thought he had her fooled, but in reality, Sophie was 2 steps ahead. Each day, she quietly gathered more information, watching, listening, taking mental notes of David's schedule and his habits. She learned when he would be out of the house, when he would be unreachable, and when he would be distracted enough not to notice her subtle sabotage. The first thing she did was discreetly start planting doubts in the minds of David's colleagues and friends. She would casually mention how stressed David seemed lately, how he had been forgetting important things, how distracted he was at work. It was all said with the utmost concern, of course, but the seeds of doubt were planted, and soon enough, David's reputation as the charming, confident professional began to waver. Next, Sophie started tampering with his work. Nothing too obvious, just enough to make him miss a few important meetings, forget key details in his presentations, and slip up in ways that made him seem careless. She would move papers around his desk, delete emails, and forget to remind him about certain deadlines. And slowly but surely, David's perfect image at the office began to crack. All the while, Sophie maintained her mask of composure. She was calm, supportive, and affectionate when David came home, making sure he had no reason to suspect that anything was amiss. But behind her smile, she was watching him unravel, her plan unfolding just as she had envisioned. The tide was turning. Sophie could feel it. And soon, David's world would crumble just as hers had, only this time, she would be the one pulling the strings. And when it was over, when David had nothing left, she would walk away with everything. Act 2. The Setup. Chapter 5. Sophie's Calculations. Sophie sat alone in the living room, her mind whirring with the intricacies of her plan. She knew David's weaknesses well. He was a man driven by two things: his career and his reputation. His professional life was the cornerstone of his identity, and he wore his success like armor, shielding himself from the world. It was how he gained respect, admiration, and influence. Sophie had no doubt that his ego rested firmly on the accolades he had earned in the business world. This was where she would strike first. Sophie knew that for her revenge to work, it couldn't be rushed. It had to be calculated, subtle, and deliberate. She would chip away at the foundation of David's life, piece by piece, until everything he had worked so hard to build crumbled around him. And she would do it without him ever suspecting that she was the architect of his downfall. At home, she maintained the image of the perfect, doting wife. She smiled when he walked in late, his excuses rehearsed but increasingly careless. She kissed him on the cheek as he headed to bed, never letting her mask slip. Appearing oblivious to his affair was essential. If David thought for even a moment that Sophie knew about Lauren or suspected his betrayal, he might become more cautious, more guarded, and her carefully crafted plan would unravel before it began. She couldn't afford that. Not now. Not when she was this close. So, she listened intently as David talked about work, asking seemingly innocent questions that gave her insight into his business dealings. It was his once solid social circle began to crumble, leaving David more isolated than ever. Meanwhile, Sophie remained the constant in his life, the supportive, loving wife who stood by his side as he faced growing difficulties at work and with friends. She was the only one left for him to confide in, and as David's paranoia grew, he leaned on her more and more, never suspecting that she was the one orchestrating his unraveling. The more isolated David became, the more Sophie's control over him solidified. He didn't see it yet, but his world was shrinking, the walls closing in. And when the time came for Sophie to strike the final blow, there would be no one left to help him. He would be utterly alone. Chapter 8. Financial Sabotage. David had always entrusted Sophie with their finances, never questioning her management. He was too wrapped up in his career, confident that Sophie, with her meticulous nature, had everything under control. But what David didn't know was that Sophie had been slowly, carefully siphoning money out of their joint accounts for months. It was a delicate process, small withdrawals here and there, nothing that would trigger any suspicion. While David's mind was consumed by his failing career and the pressure of salvaging his reputation, Sophie methodically moved their assets into offshore accounts under her name. Every step was calculated. Smaller sums transferred to her personal accounts, larger amounts discreetly invested in safe, long-term ventures that David wouldn't have access to. It wasn't enough to break him yet, but it set the groundwork for what would soon come. Meanwhile, Sophie played the supportive wife perfectly. She remained calm and composed, offering David financial advice with subtle suggestions. "Why don't you try something more aggressive?" she would say casually over dinner, knowing full well that his growing desperation to recover from the failed merger would lead him to take her advice without question. David, blinded by his ambition and the need to make up for his mounting losses, eagerly followed Sophie's suggestions. She pointed him toward investments she had researched beforehand, risky, unstable ventures that she knew were bound to fail. They looked promising on the surface, just enough to convince David that they were worth the gamble. And gamble he did. As the investments tanked, David's financial stability began to unravel. It wasn't immediate, but over the weeks, he saw more and more red flags. Each time, Sophie was right there, offering sympathy and false reassurance. "Maybe it's just bad luck," she'd say softly, stroking his hair as he sat hunched over his laptop, analyzing numbers that no longer made sense. David began to spiral. The mounting losses, the failed merger, and his dwindling professional reputation weighed heavily on him, but he still had no idea how dire his financial situation truly was. Sophie had ensured that by the time he realized the depth of the damage, it would be far too late to recover. His paranoia grew. He started to believe the world was conspiring against him, forces beyond his control, out to destroy everything he had built. He confided in Sophie, the one person he thought he could still trust. All the while, she kept up the act, silently reveling in his downfall. He was drowning, and Sophie was the only one who knew just how deep the water was. Act 3. The Breakdown. Chapter 9. The Affair Exposed. Sophie knew she had been saving the affair for the perfect moment. She had all the evidence, photos, text messages, everything the private investigator had collected. But it wasn't enough to simply confront David. No, Sophie wanted the exposure to hit him with maximum impact. She had already torn apart his career, his finances, and his friendships. All that remained was his public image, the final thread holding together what little pride he had left. David had become more erratic in recent weeks. The stress of work, the failed investments, and his shrinking social circle were taking their toll. But still same charm she had once used to support him, but now it was a weapon. She cataloged every detail, every name, every project, storing it away for future use. And as Sophie plotted, she felt a thrill she hadn't known in years. No longer was she the passive, hurt wife. She was in control now. Chapter 6. Sabotaging the Career. David's career had always been his pride and joy. He was climbing the corporate ladder with ease, his position solidified by the successful deals and mergers he orchestrated. But there was one deal in particular that had consumed him for months, a high-stakes merger that, if completed, would cement his status as a powerhouse in his company. It was risky, but the rewards would be astronomical. To Sophie, it was the perfect place to start. Through her careful questioning and observations, Sophie learned everything she needed to know about the merger. She knew which companies were involved, who the key players were, and the timeline for the deal's completion. It was delicate, and any leak of sensitive information could cause the whole thing to collapse. One evening, while David was out of the house, Sophie made her move. She used a burner phone, one she had purchased weeks earlier, to anonymously send critical details of the merger to one of David's competitors. It was a carefully crafted message, containing just enough information to be damaging without being traced back to her. The consequences were swift and devastating. Within days, whispers of the leaked information spread through David's company. The merger fell through, costing the business millions. David's colleagues were in shock, and the blame began to land squarely on his shoulders. His reputation, once pristine, took its first significant hit. The whispers in the office grew louder. Was David losing his edge? Had he gotten sloppy? At home, Sophie played her part to perfection. She feigned concern when David came home looking exhausted and defeated, her voice dripping with false empathy as she asked about the failed deal. "I'm so sorry, love," she said, her eyes filled with feigned sympathy as he confided in her. "I'm sure it wasn't your fault. Maybe something outside your control?" David shook his head, frustration evident in his tense posture. "I don't know what happened," he muttered. "It's like someone knew every detail of the merger." Sophie's heart raced with satisfaction, but her face remained calm. She leaned in, kissed his cheek, and whispered words of encouragement. "You'll bounce back. You always do." But in her mind, she knew he wouldn't. This was only the beginning. Chapter 7. Isolating David. The next phase of Sophie's plan involved David's personal life. She knew that while his career was his anchor, his social connections provided him with the validation he craved. He was always the center of attention at parties, always the one who could be counted on for a good time or sound advice. People admired him, trusted him. Sophie intended to change that. At first, she started small, planting doubts in the minds of their closest friends during casual conversations. She never outright lied. There was no need. All she had to do was drop subtle hints, comments that could easily be dismissed but would linger in people's minds. "David's been so stressed lately," she would say over dinner, her voice soft and concerned. "He's been so distracted. I hope everything's okay at work." Her friends would nod, offering comforting words, but Sophie could see the seeds of doubt taking root. And as the weeks passed, she continued her quiet campaign, dropping more hints about David's unreliability. At social gatherings, she would subtly steer conversations toward David's behavior, always under the guise of being a worried wife. He's been missing a lot of things lately. Important meetings, dinner plans. It's just not like him. Slowly but surely, their friends began to pull away from David. They weren't suspicious of the affair, but they started to see him as unreliable, distant, even untrustworthy. Clung to his reputation as a respectable businessman and loving husband. Sophie would take that from him, too. One evening, while David was out of town on yet another business trip, Sophie made her move. She knew he was with Lauren, his young assistant, the woman he had been betraying her with for nearly a year. It was time to burn everything down. Sophie used an anonymous email account to send the incriminating photos of David and Lauren to the media. She attached detailed information about the affair, dates, locations, and even screenshots of suggestive text messages. The scandal hit the internet within hours, spreading like wildfire. Social media lit up with speculation and gossip, and the images circulated through David's professional network in a matter of days. His colleagues, clients, and even close friends received the same images, exposing his infidelity to the world. Sophie could picture the scene in her mind as the news broke. David, walking into meetings, only to be met with cold stares and whispered conversations. His once sterling reputation, now shattered. When David returned home from his trip, exhausted and unsuspecting, Sophie was waiting for him. She had staged the perfect scene, the picture of a devastated wife. She sat in the living room, her eyes red and puffy from crying, a box of tissues beside her. As soon as he walked through the door, Sophie let the tears fall, her voice trembling with anger and heartbreak. "How could you, David?" she demanded, her words laced with venom. "How could you do this to me? To us?" David froze, his face pale as he quickly pieced together what had happened. His hands trembled as he tried to explain, to beg for her forgiveness. But Sophie was relentless, hurling accusations and sobs in his direction, perfectly playing the role of the heartbroken wife. "I trusted you. I loved you. And you threw it all away for her?" she screamed, her voice breaking in just the right places. David, overwhelmed by the scandal and the crumbling facade of his life, fell to his knees in front of her, begging for another chance. He promised her everything: therapy, change, anything she wanted, if only she would stay. But Sophie was far from done. She wasn't crying out of heartbreak. She was crying out of triumph. She had torn down the empire he had built with his lies and betrayal, and now he was nothing. He was broken, kneeling before her, his world in ruins, exactly where she had wanted him all along. Chapter 10. David's desperation. David's life had collapsed into chaos. His career, which he had built with meticulous care, was in ruins. The failed merger, the public scandal, and the loss of trust from his colleagues and clients had left him isolated and vulnerable. His once impeccable reputation, the cornerstone of his success, was now nothing but whispers and accusations. Lauren, the young assistant he had risked everything for, had already distanced herself. She was young, ambitious, and smart enough to see that staying with David would only drag her down. Without a word, she cut ties, leaving David to face the storm alone. Desperate and defeated, David turned to the one person he thought he could still rely on: Sophie. In his frantic state, he believed that if she could find it in her heart to forgive him, they could somehow rebuild what he had destroyed. He pleaded with her, tears in his eyes, promising to end the affair with Lauren and to make things right between them. Sophie, watching him unravel, felt a twisted sense of satisfaction. She could see the broken man in front of her, begging for mercy, unaware that the person he was pleading with had been the architect of his downfall. But Sophie was a master of emotional manipulation. She had prepared for this moment. She played the role of the conflicted but forgiving wife perfectly, her face a mixture of sadness and reluctant hope. "We can get through this," she said softly, placing a trembling hand on his. "If you're willing to change, we can rebuild. But it's going to take time, David. You have to earn my trust back." David, overcome with guilt and remorse, nodded vigorously. He clung to her words, convinced that he had been given a second chance. Little did he know, Sophie had no intention of staying with him. This was merely the final stage of her plan: to see him suffer a little longer, to watch him scramble to pick up the pieces of a life she had systematically destroyed. Every time he believed he was making progress, she would pull the rug out from under him once more. As David desperately tried to make amends, Sophie remained calm, calculating. She had already set the wheels in motion for the final move. Chapter 11. The Final Move. While David poured his energy into salvaging what was left of his life, Sophie was preparing her final, devastating blow. The assets were all in her control now, hidden away in accounts that David couldn't touch. She had drained his financial resources, and yet he still had no idea how deep the hole really was. The moment she had been waiting for had arrived. Sophie had been carefully crafting her exit strategy for months, and now it was time to execute it. The divorce papers were ready, and with a cold precision, she served them to David when he least expected it, on an evening when he came home, looking exhausted but hopeful, still believing they were rebuilding their marriage. David opened the envelope, his hands shaking as he scanned the words. Divorce. It hit him like a physical blow. He looked up at Sophie, confused, hurt, and utterly defeated. "You knew," he whispered, his voice hoarse. "You knew the whole time." Sophie's face was emotionless as she stood across from him, arms crossed, her gaze steady. "Of course I knew, David," she said coldly. "I knew about Lauren. I knew about the affair from the beginning." David's eyes widened in shock, and his heart pounded as the realization of what she was saying settled in. "You think all of this was a coincidence?" Sophie continued, her voice calm but dripping with quiet satisfaction. "The failed merger, your lost investments, your crumbling reputation, I orchestrated every part of it." David felt a wave of nausea wash over him. He staggered backward, gripping the edge of the kitchen counter to steady himself. "Why? Why would you do this?" Sophie took a step closer, her eyes gleaming with cold fury. "Because you betrayed me, and I wanted you to feel the weight of that betrayal. I wanted you to lose everything that mattered to you, piece by piece, just like I did." David stood there, frozen in disbelief, his mind racing as he pieced together the full extent of her revenge. He had thought she was blind to his infidelity, thought he had gotten away with it. But the truth was far more devastating. She had known all along and had been systematically dismantling his life from the inside. "I trusted you," he whispered, his voice breaking. Sophie laughed, a low, bitter sound. "You never should have. I waited patiently, watching you dig your own grave, and now I'm walking away with everything." She left him standing there, stunned and broken, as she walked out of their home for the last time. The divorce would strip him of his remaining assets, but Sophie didn't care about the money anymore. She had already won. David was left with nothing. His wealth, his reputation, his career, and his marriage, all shattered. In the end, it wasn't Sophie who had destroyed him. It was his own arrogance, his own choices, and the cold, calculated brilliance of the woman he had underestimated. Sophie walked away, her dignity intact, her revenge complete. David's suffering was finally over, but it was only just beginning for him as he faced the wreckage of his life, knowing that the woman he had betrayed had outsmarted him in every possible way. Chapter 12. Sophie's Victory. Sophie sat in her new, tastefully decorated apartment, a glass of champagne in her hand, reflecting on how flawlessly her plan had unfolded. The divorce had been finalized without a hitch. Every asset, every penny she had, carefully siphoned from David, was now legally hers. She had walked away with their wealth, leaving David financially and emotionally destitute. The media had torn him apart after the photos of his affair surfaced. His once pristine reputation was in shambles, his career irreparably damaged. The whispers in the industry, the cold shoulders from former friends, and the subtle but deadly exclusion from business deals all painted a picture of a man who had fallen from grace. David had been at the top, but now he was nothing but a cautionary tale, destroyed by his own arrogance and deceit. Sophie's satisfaction wasn't rooted in the material gains, though they certainly helped. What truly mattered was the look on David's face when he realized that she had orchestrated his downfall. Every step of the way, she had been there, playing the supportive wife while slowly chipping away at his world. He had trusted her, believed she was his ally, and that trust was the very thing that had allowed her to destroy him so thoroughly. Sophie had never wanted to hurt anyone like this, but after discovering his betrayal, after feeling the pain he had caused her, she had been driven by one simple thought: he deserved to suffer. And now, he had. There was no one left for David. His business partners had distanced themselves, his friends doubted him, and Lauren had abandoned him at the first sign of trouble. He was utterly alone, while Sophie had walked away with her dignity, her wealth, and the satisfaction of seeing her revenge carried out perfectly. As she looked out the window of her new life, she knew she had won. Not just the money, not just the social standing. She had won her freedom. Chapter 13. The Twist. Months after the dust had settled, Sophie was finally at peace. She had re-established herself in new social circles, focusing on building a life free from the shadow of David's deceit. She was moving on, rebuilding on her terms. But one evening, as she scrolled through her phone, a notification from an unknown number caught her attention. The message was short: "There are things you never knew about David." Sophie's heart skipped a beat as she stared at the screen. Her thumb hovered over the message, reading and rereading the words. Who had sent it? How did they know her? And most unsettling of all, what secrets had David still been keeping from her? The message lacked any details, but the implications were enough to make Sophie's stomach turn. She had spent months meticulously unraveling his life, convinced that she knew everything. Yet, the thought that there were still pieces of the puzzle she hadn't uncovered sent a shiver down her spine. Had there been more affairs? More lies? Was there something darker lurking beneath the surface that even she hadn't seen? Sophie prided herself on her control, her foresight, but this message threw everything into question. For a moment, she considered digging deeper. Whoever had sent the message clearly wanted her to know something she had missed. But then, as quickly as the fear had crept in, Sophie smiled. It didn't matter. Whatever secrets David had hidden, they no longer held any power over her. She had already won. She had taken his career, his reputation, his wealth, and his pride. Nothing could change that. Even if there were more lies, more betrayals buried beneath the surface, Sophie had already claimed her victory. She deleted the message without responding, her expression calm and resolute. David's secrets would die with him, but Sophie had her life, her freedom, and her dignity intact. In the end, it wasn't the details that mattered. It was that she had risen above, destroyed the man who had tried to betray her, and walked away stronger than ever. Sophie poured herself another glass of champagne, toasting to the ultimate victory, moving on without looking back. The end.